our results in. First major thing, of course, is that it's very low in salinity. This map we created in the SEAmBOTH project. The more green it is, the fresher the water is, and it's more saline in the blue side. And you can see the big rivers like Kemi River and Tornio River, they will bring the water towards west because that's the major way of the currents going anti-clockwise in the Bothnian Bay. Another, and about the low salinity is that we have many freshwater species, but no marine species like bladderwrack or blue mussels. We have Anodonta anatina, which is a duck mussel, which is a completely freshwater species, but we still have it out in the open in the Bothnian Bay National Park, for example. Then we have humic brown, dark brown water because the catchment area is very large. There's bogs and mires, lots of timber industry, which brings us this very humic water. You can see what color it is on the right side. And this turbidity map was created in this SEAmBOTH project as well from the remote sensing techniques. And it shows that especially the river areas, you have lots of turbidity, meaning that you can't see through the water. And this is one major thing because the vegetation can't live very deep because they don't get light. So mostly we get vegetation in between 0 and 6 or 7 meters. This sea area is really shallow, except for the little blue deeper part in the Swedish side, but especially the Finnish side is very, very shallow, and the shoreline is like this, not steep like this. And it also means that there's almost no vegetation zones. Like if you look at the southern sea areas in the Bothnian Bay, Baltic Sea, you get different zones of vegetation, but we don't have that due to the very long, low coastline. This is an example of a dive transect where there is absolutely no vegetation zones, even though at the beginning of the transect, there's a pile of rocks, which is called a reef. There's no like filamentous algal zones. Everything is just mixed together. And of course, we have half a year of ice, sea ice. Not this year. This is a strange year, but usually we have it. And then we don't have any tide here, but we have very large water level changes because of the winds. The prevailing wind direction is from southwest, and that pushes the water to the northern parts of the Baltic Sea, and it has nowhere to go. So it rises the water level, even 2 to 3 meters in a few days. This is 2 months scale from Oulu area, and as you can see, it has gone from -100 and something to more than +140. This is just an example of a water level rise at the Tornio River estuary. And one more important thing about the Bothnian Bay is that all the other sea areas in the Baltic Sea are limited by nitrogen, but the Bothnian Bay is limited by phosphorus. And this means that most of the time we don't have blue-green algal blooms here. This is the reason. So Bothnian Bay is more like an oligotrophic lake than a eutrophic sea. And this change goes until, or this situation goes until about the Kvarken area. And then south from Kvarken area, you have the other way around. So the nitrogen is the limiting factor. If you look at the species plan here, most of the endangered aquatic species of the Baltic Sea are found here in the northern parts of the Baltic Sea. If you look at the color codes, the blue ones are the endangered species that are existing right now. The green and orange ones are historical ones. So that's a a special thing here in the northern Bothnian Bay. Then about the biological methods that we used in both countries. We used drop videos, so parking the boat here and putting down a GoPro camera, taking 1 minute of a video and then analyzing the video. In the deeper parts, then we did a lot of wading, meaning that we walked in the water with the water binocular, looked through the surface and saw what was underneath. And also we did a lot of diving and snorkeling. And then about the results. Over to you.
Yes. So in short, I'm going to give you a quick tour through what we actually have been finding here and some of the most, we think, interesting parts of the results. Firstly, well, we do have quite a few species within the northern Bothnian Bay. Around through vascular plant species, we've been able to find 114 and 116 respectively in Sweden and Finland, coming out from 9 different genuses. Charophytes, so this special type of algae that are quite special for like the northern parts of the Bothnian Bay. 9 and 10 different species of them have been found during this time. Water moss species, so actually freshwater mosses that we found out in the sea here, are 16 and 22 respectively. And other than algae and cyanobacteria, 22 and 27. And this totals up to 162 and 174. So let's say around 170 different species of actual macrophytes, like larger plant species, you can see. And I think that's something I don't think any one of us thought that we would actually have up here, because it usually said, oh no, you have so few species up there in the northern Baltic. Yeah. The most common ones then. So what does it look like in kind of a general, normal type of bottom? Well, from our data, that shows that the most common species that we have been finding is unidentified attached filamentous algae. So that green kind of fluffy stuff that grows on top of anything. That's the way most common one. But after that comes the perfoliate pondweed, Avenvita or Olnate. Yeah, and this is the one that grows, you find it pretty much anywhere. Deep, shallow, exposed, sheltered places. It's a very, very universal plant. Needle spikerush, or the Hapsiloica nålsäv. They are the very, very short ones, grows like grass on a lawn, and mostly you find them in the very shallow parts, almost up on land. Then we have this group of the Caranitella, so they are the charophytes, a larger group of the charophytes, which I said, not surprisingly, they are common around here. And last but not least, the 5th most common one is a type of charophyte, and it's the rough stonewort, the Cara aspera, as it's called. And that's also a plant that is kind of quite universal. You find it in more sandy, in more sheltered places. So often can grow in sort of meadows as well. Returning to the summary of our data, and we can see, as I said earlier, that you see the similarities are quite strikingly. It's very similar in what we find in Sweden and Finland. There are not so much differences there when it comes to number of species. And the differences you see here is probably most likely that because we have in Finland have been having a lot more data collected, a lot more inventories done. So I think sooner or later we will move up to about the same number of species. But however, there are some differences, some striking differences between our 2 countries. One of them is the presence of the waterweed, the Elodea nuttali, which is classified on the EU level as an alien invasive species. It's a species that we have in Sweden, quite commonly found all the way almost towards Haparanda, and it's kind of lurking on the border to get over to Tornio, and it's not been found yet so far in Finland. So yeah, they are hoping it will stay there, not crossing the border. But that is definitely a difference, as we found it quite a lot in Sweden. Some other major differences that we found is when it comes to endangered species. And as Essie said, we have quite a lot of them in proportion to the amount of species that are in danger up here in the north. And an example of this endangered species, the Hipporis tetraphylla, ishavshästsvans in Swedish. And it's classified as vulnerable in Finland and critically endangered in Sweden. In Finland, you'll have it quite a few places around Krunit area, also on the coastal mainland. In Sweden, we don't have it at all. There is only, not in the SEAmBOTH area, it's only found further south in our next neighboring county in one place, and that's why it's considered as critically endangered. And that's something we have been wondering about, because our environment is very similar, but still we don't have it in Sweden. The opposite then is with this charophyte, the Cara brownie. It is classified as vulnerable in both countries, but this one we have quite a lot of in Sweden. We have more of a meadows in the Haparanda area, where in Finland you'll only be finding them in a few places, and more of the odd individuals of them. And also the Alisma wallenbergii, småsvalting, which is on the EU Habitats Directive list of prioritized species. So we have a certain reason to keep them here. But there is also mostly found a lot more in Finland. And what we do with all these findings is that with all this data, we can make models and maps of the potential sites where these species may be found. And this is something Elina will show us a bit more later today in this afternoon. But this is an example of what it can look like. But she'll tell us more about how the process goes from our data into the maps. And a few words about the water mosses, because they are a big thing here up in the northern part of the Baltic, the Bothnian Bay. Like Linnea said earlier, water mosses are mainly freshwater species. You can find them in lakes and streams and rivers, but also in the very low salinity brackish water here in the Bothnian Bay. And in Sweden, we found 16 species and 22 species in Finland at the moment. But the fact that we still found 6 new species last year on the Finnish side tells us that we still don't know the whole truth about this, because we have been investigating our area since 2006 very intensively. So 12 years of field studies, and since still last year we found 6 new species. But one reason is that we've gone to the river estuaries in the SEAmBOTH investigations, because that's kind of a place where marine biologists don't tend to go, but then terrestrial people won't go as well, or the freshwater people don't go. And SEAmBOTH brought an enormous amount of data about the water mosses in Sweden, because previously there were only a few species were known to exist. This is a graph of accumulation of water moss species in the northern Bothnian Bay on the Finnish side. So as we've done more and more field studies, we've grown to know more and more about the water mosses. But as you see,
in the SEAmBOTH project, we found it was a leap of knowledge that we gained with these field studies. And this is just a peculiarity, but this is Emeritus Professor Tauno Ulvinen from Oulu University, 90 years old, who still does our species identification. He works about 4 days a week. So then a few words about the river estuary mapping. Like I said, we decided to go to the river estuaries because the national inventories that we've had here in Finland haven't really gone into estuaries because it's not considered as a sea area. But then again, how do you define where the river ends and the sea begins? And one thing that we did was that by expert opinion, we decided which species are river species, which are brackish water species, and which can be anywhere. And we got this map. The green dots are river vegetation and the blue dots are brackish water vegetation. And the pink area is the official river estuary Natura 2000 habitat in Finland. So if we look at the results, according to this analysis, the river estuary is, well, the plants think that it's slightly smaller than what we are reporting to the EU right now. But then again, we have these river species or freshwater species on the islands as well. And we've done this analysis over the whole SEAmBOTH area. And from this perspective, you can nicely see how the blue dots, the marine species, are out in the middle, and then the green dots are actually near the coastline. Then when we were analyzing our differences in the Natura 2000 habitats, one big difference can be found between Finland and Sweden. In Finland, since we don't have tide, we don't have the tidal mudflats. Sweden has tide, especially on the west side, west coast. So they do have these tidal mudflats. This is a HELCOM map on the left side upper corner, where in the orange areas you can find mudflats, but like I said, not on the Finnish side. But then when we have been talking together, we realized that we do have a lot of these mudflats. They're just not tidal, so they are not Natura habitats, but they are really important habitats because there's very many endangered aquatic species that live there. Also, they are important feeding areas for migrating birds, and there's many human pressures on these areas. So we did an aerial analysis of the mudflats in Finnish side as well. And one really good technique for really shallow areas like the mudflats would be the drone orthomosaics.
And finally, to conclude, we got some new findings, these brand new findings, which one is a very good one, is that on the right there you can see in Sweden, for the first time, we found this, the Macroplea pubipennis, this leaf beetle species that has been known to exist in Finland, but not in Sweden at all. And it's also one of these species on the EU Habitats Directive list. So that was quite fun for us in Sweden to know that it actually exists in Sweden, and a lot of them in the SEAmBOTH area. So it's been there all the time. It's just that no one ever looked for it, pretty much what it is. The other finding is maybe not as exciting in the sense, and that's the round goby. This is also classified as an invasive alien species that exists in the southern parts of the Baltic Sea. And on the Finnish side, they've been now finding it all the way up and for the first time to Oulu. On the Swedish side, we don't have it this far north at all. Stops around Stockholm or somewhere there. So this is something we need to keep our eyes open for in the future. Yeah, and before we leave over to concluding, all these data that we have collected to be able to put them in the map, especially in a map where we want to show the biodiversity and the nature values, we need to assess the nature values of this data. And in this project, we used a framework called Mosaic. It's developed in Sweden, a framework for nature value assessments in the marine environment, and where you assess species and ecotypes based upon 4 different criteria. And they get kind of a value of scoring a point. And when we did this with the focus, like having the perspective from the northern Bothnian Bay, so we valued what is important from our perspective up here. As we've been saying, as we're talking about the estuaries, received a very high score, just as well as the sand and mud flats, and also these shallow macrophyte meadows. So these type of places are certainly one of our most valuable parts. But this have been put together into the nature value maps, and again, this will come in the afternoon when we listen to Elina's presentation about developing the biodiversity maps. Okay. Any questions? Any questions? Yes.